Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the January 20th meeting of the City of Santa Barbara Water Commission meeting. This is our first meeting of the year, so a belated Happy New Year to everyone. Let me have the roll call of the commissioners if we could. Madam Clerk.
Yes, Commissioner Keller is absent today. Commissioner Kammeier?
Present.
Commissioner Cooney?
Present, right.
Vice Chair Young?
I'm here.
Chair Davis?
Present, thank you very much. That takes us to item C. This is actually number 4 on our agenda. This is public comment for items within the purview of the Water Commission, but not on today's agenda. Madam Clerk, is there anyone who wishes or has raised their hand who wishes to speak under general public comment at this point?
Chair Davis, there is no public comment at this time.
Great, thank you very much. That takes us to item 5. This is the consent calendar. The first item is A, the meeting minutes for the meeting of December 16th, 2021. Item B is a sole source agreement with Hydronics Inc. Incorporated for the purchase and installation of smart cover level sensor units. And item C, an increased funding for water main replacement design services for fiscal year 23A, water main replacement. Are there any questions or comments on either of those two items? I will have to abstain on the minutes because I was not at the last meeting. Any other questions or comments? Okay, that is there a motion to approve the consent calendar?
I will move it for adoption.
Okay, Commissioner Young and Commissioner Cooney has seconded it. Could I have a roll call on that vote, please?
Yes, Commissioner Keller is absent. Commissioner Kammeier?
Yes.
Commissioner Cooney?
Yep.
Vice Chair Young?
Yes.
And Chair Davis?
I abstain on the minutes, but vote yes on the consent calendar.
Thank you.
The motion passes 4-0 with 1 absent. Takes us to our administrative items. The first item is the annual water system presentation. Mr. Hagmark or Mr. Ward, would you like to kick this one off?
Sure. Good morning, Chair Davis, Council Liaison SNED and Water Commissioners. I am Matt Ward. I'm the Water System Manager, and I have the pleasure of presenting to you the Water System Annual Report this year, along with some other staff. Next slide. So here's an outline of what we're going to present today. We're going to do a brief water system overview, and then we're going to dive into our treatment and distribution program updates, where we're going to do kind of a deeper dive and invite you to ask questions as we go. Each presenter is going to kind of take a pause and see if you have any questions as we go. So that way we can kind of field questions, but also keep on track because we have a lot to pack into a short presentation. And then we're going to be reviewing some of our capital improvement project updates. Next slide. So as you can see, I report to Joshua Hagmark, and I'm supported by 2 superintendents, one being Andrew Rhodes, our water treatment superintendent, who will be presenting today, as well as Robbie Days, water distribution superintendent, who will be also joining this presentation. Next slide. And I think it's important to mention that we do have a diverse supply of water sources. And so that does shape our water system. And in fact, we are a T5, D5 water system, which is the highest rated in the state. You're very familiar with our different sources, our state water, our San Ynez water, as well as our groundwater desalination and our recycled water system, which we're going to touch a bit on today, but just briefly, we're going to really be focusing today on our potable water system. Next slide. So what you see here is kind of the 10,000 foot elevation of the city's water system. And it's comprised of 3 potable water treatment facilities that are connected through 300 miles of potable water system or transmission mains and water mains, and also 13 reservoirs, 14 pump stations, and over 27,000 service connections. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Andrew Rhodes. Next slide, our water treatment superintendent.
Good morning, Chair Davis, Water Commission. My name is Andrew Rhodes, Water Treatment Superintendent, and I'll be providing a brief update on some of the programs under the water treatment section for fiscal year 21. Next slide. The water treatment section of Water Resources is responsible for drinking water quality, supporting water supply management with projection data, both surface and groundwater, coordinating diversions from Gibraltar Reservoir, and consulting on desal related topics. We also coordinate with member and neighboring agencies such as Kachuma Operation and Maintenance Board, or COAM, who is responsible for the operation and maintenance of all facilities and infrastructure associated with the Kachuma project, with the exception of Bradbury Dam. Their responsibilities include the intake tower at Lake Kachuma, Tekaloti Tunnel, the South Coast Conduit, and 4 balancing reservoirs, including Laurel Reservoir, which serves as the forebay for Cater Water Treatment Plant, where Gibraltar and Kachuma water blends prior to treatment. Montecito and Carpinteria Valley Water Districts share with the operation and maintenance and capital costs at Cater through a joint powers agreement. We treat their Lake Kachuma water prior to delivery to their districts via the South Coast Conduit. We also coordinate with Lacumba Mutual Water Company and Goleta Water District regarding water quality, supply, and project planning. The picture on the bottom right shows Winter Martinez performing biannual filter maintenance and inspection of filter media for life cycle analysis. Next slide, please. Cater is the home base for the treatment staff and our operations. The picture shows Dean Carr monitoring the treatment process at Cater using our SCADA computers. Ortega Groundwater Treatment Plant supplements surface supplies during times of drought or emergency. And there are 4 downtown wells, Veracruz, City Hall, Corporation Yard, and High School that currently supply the plant. We have an upcoming project to connect a 5th well, Alameda Park, to the facility for treatment prior to delivery into the distribution system. We are also responsible for the operation and maintenance of the hydroelectric plant, where when there's water in Gibraltar, diversions are conveyed through Mission Tunnel to the hydroelectric plant located on the north side of Laurel Reservoir. Electricity produced from the facility can completely offset all of Cater's electrical demands on a good year, which I would define as a year when Gibraltar spills. Next slide, please. So as mentioned before, Montecito and Carpinteria Valley Water Districts participate in both operational and capital project costs for Cater, which are defined by a joint powers agreement that was established in 1978 and followed by expanding Cater's capacity by adding 5 additional filters and constructing the South Coast Conduit Booster Pump Station to convey the treated water. Our JPA members cover 40%, or roughly 40% of operation and maintenance budget, as well as the capital budget for projects at Cater. This slide shows a 10-year chart highlighting the percent of Cater's annual overall production that supplied Santa Barbara customers in blue versus Montecito and Carpinteria in green. You can clearly see on the chart when water conservation measures took effect with the last drought, with a greater than 25% reduction in total plant production, and the slight rebound that we experienced starting in fiscal year 18. This chart is somewhat skewed in that the past 3 years or so, the desal plant has consistently contributed water to help meet the city's demand, which would have otherwise been supplied by Cater. And so those blue bars, at least for 18 through 20, would be slightly higher without desal. Next slide, please. The hydroelectric plant is an amazing resource to help offset some of the city's electrical demand. The chart shows the electricity generated at the hydro for fiscal year 21. In just over half a year of operation, we generated 75% of all the electricity used at Cater that year. Last winter was significantly below average for rainfall, and Gibraltar did not see any runoff. So by January 2021, it was empty. This winter has been better so far. It's filled to just over 50% capacity. So hopefully a few more storms will come and we'll fill it completely. Next slide, please. There was no groundwater production in FY21. We have been resting our groundwater basins for the past several years, allowing for continued recovery after heavy pumping during the last drought. We took advantage of this resting period to clean and rehabilitate Corporation Yard Well in 2020. And the current plan is to start up Ortega groundwater treatment plant this coming August to help supplement supply. This is subject to change depending on how much additional rain we receive this winter and how much recovery our surface water supplies experience. I would expect, however, that if Lake Cachuma doesn't see significant inflow and rise and increase in storage, that we'll be starting up the plant this coming summer. And so with that, I'd like to open it up for any questions before turning it over to the next presenter.
Any questions from any of the commission at this point?
Yes,
Yeah, Commissioner Young, go ahead.
thanks, Chair Davis. Just a question on Cater. So does all of the Lake Cachuma water come into Cater, or is that reservoir that I think precedes Cater that diverts some of that flow?
Yeah, so the reservoir that you see across the street from Cater on San Roque Road, the big reservoir that you can see from our foothills, hiking trails, et cetera, is Laurel Reservoir. And that acts as the forebay. So all of Lake Cachuma water that Goleta doesn't take ends up cascading into Laurel Reservoir unless we're fed directly. If there's some caveats to that. We can feed directly off of the conduit before it enters the reservoir, Laurel Reservoir, but 99.9% of the time, it's cascading down that waterfall into Laurel Reservoir. And then on the backside is where Gibraltar, the north side of the reservoir is where Gibraltar comes in. And so those two sources blend there prior to treatment.
And then so from Laurel, who do we manage that? Does the city manage Laurel, or is that part of some?
That's part of Combs' responsibility and part of the Cachuma project.
Okay.
So, I mean, we work closely with them, coordinating diversions, right? They're trying to figure out and maintain a certain rise or rate of rise or fall in that reservoir. And that depends on how much water Goleta is taking and the city's taking and how much we expect Montecito and Carpinteria to take. So there is a fair amount of coordination there, just trying to figure out the daily demand for the systems, various systems.
Great. Thank you.
No problem.
Any other questions? Okay, let's continue.
All right, with that, I'd like to turn it over to Robbie Days, Water Distribution Superintendent.
Thank you, Andrew. Good morning, commissioners. My name is, next slide, please. My name is Robbie Days. I'm the recently appointed Water Distribution Superintendent. And today I'll be giving you an overview of the Water Distribution Work Group, as well as some of our recent performance highlights. So next slide, please. Right, so Water Distribution is a fairly large group with 34 full-time staff members supported by 3 supervisors with their own work groups. Here we have a list of some of our general responsibilities, our most obvious responsibility being the maintenance and repair of the potable and recycled water distribution systems. We've also been responsible for the metering program and customer service, but our recent reorg has now transferred the metering program to the Water Services Work Group while maintaining a shared responsibility for customer service. We oversee the storage and quality control of our water supply once it leaves Cater treatment plant. And lastly, for this slide, I believe is an understated but important part of what we do, and that would be our level of coordination with other agencies and work groups, public and private. Here we have listed some of the groups that we work with, from the City Public Works Permits Counter to the Land Development Team, especially with the uptick in increased density development that the city has seen in recent years. Our staff helps scope and process water-related construction permits, but also actually builds the underground infrastructure to support these projects. We also coordinate with a lot of other city work groups on asset conflict and considerations for city capital projects. We work with transportation, streets, wastewater, parks, water engineering for our own capital projects, and even creeks. Actually, our most recent project being the Arroyo Burro pedestrian bridge, which is a creeks improvement initiative that involved relocating our water main that was previously running across the creek and incorporating that relocation into the design of the new pedestrian bridge. This coordination gave us the opportunity to raise our water main above the 100-year flood line while adding protection in the form of the bridge structure itself. We also work closely with our neighboring utility agencies. We share interties with Goleta and Montecito water districts, as well as the Cumberland Mutual. And we also coordinate through project conflicts with SoCal Gas, Frontier, SoCal Edison, and Caltrans. I'm sure most of you have experienced the 101 freeway widening project currently taking place, and we're actually working through some conflict with our water mains on that project at this moment. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we have 3 work groups. We recently undergone some changes to how those work groups are structured. The first group I'm going to talk about would be our pipeline operations group, also known as ops and maintenance. As you can see, they are responsible for the majority of our visible work. If you're out and about in the community, these are the staff that you would most likely see working on the infrastructure that's in the public right of way. Here we have 2 of our technicians, Garrett Torres and Eric Rivas, in the process of replacing a fire hydrant. So like I said, this group tackles a lot of right-of-way work from water main breaks, which is one of our program highlights I'll touch on in a later slide, to NODES water main flushing, which has been a high-profile program during our drought conditions. It's a more sustainable approach to cleaning our water mains using a neutral output discharge elimination system, better known as a NODES truck or a filtration truck, to pull water from our system, circulate and filter it, capture water quality data, treat it, and reintroduce it back into our system. And that's a change from the traditional method of water main flushing, which involves really discharging water from our fire hydrants into the gutter and storm drains. It's taken a lot to develop that program, but it's definitely been worth it, given our often critical supply circumstances. This crew is also responsible for valve maintenance, meter replacement, customer service, fire hydrant maintenance as pictured in the photo, and new service installations. Next slide, please. The second group is our pumps and reservoirs maintenance operations group, also known as our pump crew. Their major focus, as the name suggests, would be the maintenance of our pump stations and reservoirs. If you'll notice the bottom picture on the slide, that would be the pump crew cleaning the inside of reservoir number 2, located just behind the Santa Barbara Mission. Their duties are a little more technical, and they require knowledge of the functionality of our pumps and reservoirs. The work that this crew performs can impact large portions of the overall system. They also maintain distribution's groundwater wells, which, similar to Cater's wells, are being rested to recharge the basin. They maintain 18 pressure reducing valve stations, which are the connection points or interties between our pressure zones, maintaining the system pressure for all of our customers. The photo above actually is the Ontario PRV, located in a vault quite a ways up the hill on North Ontario Street. There are also 2 subgroups that branch off from this group, one being the full-time on-site Gibraltar Dam caretaker and the operator that assists him with maintenance of our dam facilities, and the CSOS or Control Systems Operator Group that maintains, troubleshoots, and manages our SCADA system, allowing us to remotely monitor and control certain aspects of the water system. Next slide, please. And lastly, our planning and coordination group, which is a broad and versatile combination of positions that have a few different functions. They are the in-house support for our field operations in the form of managing our software, coordinating the processing and review of planned work, and general admin support. As you can see, our dispatch and our metering crews were housed in this group up until the recent reorg, so they are now under water services. This group manages our asset management software, specifically our planner scheduler, who works closely with staff to document our work and oversee the preventative maintenance methods. Our coordinators are under this group as well, handling our utility coordination and plan review. Also our cross-connection team looking out for the safety of our drinking water and enforcing standards and regulations for the distribution group as a whole. Recycled water user agreements and customer interactions are also facilitated with this group. So this group really has a broad range of skills and duties. But I think the program that I'm most excited about with this group is our developing GPS program. A couple of years ago, we started collecting high precision GPS data for our assets. I think for anyone who spent long, cold nights troubleshooting our underground infrastructure with old maps, they would be the ones to appreciate this effort the most. But we're really making an effort to incorporate GPS data collection as a normal step in all of our programs. It just makes maintaining our system easier. Knowing centimeter accurate depths and alignments has obvious construction benefits, but also mitigates safety hazards and damage that can occur from prolonged water leaks. The photo on the slide is actually our planner scheduler, Nick Galati, working with an inspector to capture some data points on a water main installation. It's a continued development, and I'm hoping to have some GPS-related performance objectives in the near future, so more to come on that. Next slide, please. But for this year's performance highlights, we've got 4 programs that I'll be discussing: our emergency water main repair, our valve maintenance, our customer service, and our fire hydrant inspection and maintenance program. Next slide, please. In this slide, we have a photo of a water main repair. On the backhoe, we have Alfonso Lopez, one of our more experienced technicians. So compared to all the types of work that we do, water main repair is definitely the most visible and impactful for the community in various ways. It's messy. We usually have to reroute traffic. It's loud, and the water service is often disrupted. Our response in this area can greatly affect the public perception of our entire work group and the city as a whole. And that's why we have a performance metric like the one shown. We aim for completing all of our emergency main repairs within 12 hours of receiving the call from the reporting party. But we set the target at 90% because some main breaks have considerations that others do not. Some main breaks can be addressed without shutting down the water main, with our only community impact being traffic rerouting and construction noise. But other mains can be difficult to access for reasons such as being encased in a bridge or freeway crossing or on a remote easement that would require a non-standard repair. Others may require a shutdown of water service to that block, or in some cases, multiple city blocks. And when we've determined that a shutdown is needed, we also have to look at who it affects. We have medical facilities, schools, restaurants that are all significantly impacted by a disruption in water service. So we weigh those community needs against the severity of potential risk for damage or loss. And that's really going to be a different scenario for every main break that we come across. As you can see, we were a little over 93% this year. I'm happy about that. And I definitely appreciate the long hours that these crews put in under some often unpleasant circumstances or conditions. Rain or shine, 24 hours a day. They're a hardworking group. So next slide, please. Here we have a graph showing our water main break history over the last 40 years. As you see, there's a noticeable increase in breaks heading into the 2000s. That trend was an indication of aging infrastructure, as a large portion of our water mains were installed in the 50s and 60s and reaching the end of their useful life. One of the efforts adopted to combat this problem was the increase to our main replacement mileage to 2% after FY18. As you can see, FY19 through FY21, the increased scope appears to have contributed to a downward trend in our main break numbers. We're seeing the same trend this year, with our current tally being at 35 main breaks for fiscal year 22. But refinement of our approach is an ongoing task, and we aim to drive that number down as much as we possibly can. So next slide, please. The next performance metric that I'll be discussing is our valve maintenance target of exercising 4,500 valves every year, which is roughly half of our system isolation valves. Our valve maintenance program involves targeting the valves in our system on a preventative maintenance schedule and operating them to either confirm or restore functionality and flag any valves that are not functioning properly and need to be replaced. This is important for because our isolation valves are the sole mechanism used for shutting down water mains during emergencies. So faulty valves equals a prolonged inability to shut off water, which in turn equals increased potential for damage, increased water loss, and an increase to the number of customers affected by emergency-related outages. But bad valves can also negatively affect planned work. It often increases the scope and notification needs for planned projects, often extending construction schedules, which can have budgetary consequences and lead to bad community relations. And valves that are completely broken, closed, and unaddressed may not be a visible threat, but can create water quality issues in the form of unintended dead ends and not allowing for the grid circulation that our system is designed to do. As you can see in the graph, we were close to reaching our target this past fiscal year, but have struggled in past years. This is an AWWA recommended maintenance practice, so we did make some adjustments to help get us closer to our target. And we're continuing to improve our strategy. Some of the adjustments that we've made are adding additional staff so that we have more resources to spread across the entirety of our annual objectives. We also purchased an additional vehicle with a valve actuator so that we could deploy 2 crews at a time in case one was tied up with capital project support. The recent increase in targeted main replacement mileage also meant an increase in shutdown coordination and support for this group specifically. But I think that we received the most benefit from taking this objective and using it to dive deeper into the work that we were tracking in our asset management software. We were able to expand our query into other types of work, such as main repair, which requires valve operation for shutdowns under the same criteria as our valve maintenance program. And that wasn't being captured in our reporting before. So now we not only account for the exercising of that valve, but add that data to the overall preventative maintenance schedule, meaning less duplicated work and a more accurate account of what our valve maintenance needs really are. And in this photo, we have Ernesto Lazaro, one of our Tech 2s, demonstrating how to manually operate one of our water valves. Next slide, please. So in this slide, I'm going to touch on our customer service / service call efforts. In this photo, we have recently appointed water services supervisor, Sean Bakir, who's usually found hard at work managing the metering workload and our control tent dispatch, among other duties. The chart on the left shows how the roughly 6,000 service calls we received this past year were dispersed throughout our work groups, with 11% being assigned to our metering group through our customer information system, or CIS, 42% being processed through Control 10, our daytime dispatch, usually making it to our customer service technicians, and 47% being processed through our after-hours dispatch or transferred over from our daytime technicians to the after-hours operators, who are emergency service workers, or ESWs. The chart on the right shows us how those same calls or work requests are categorized, the bulk of the work being meter maintenance and meter turn-ons, but also including meter clean-arounds to allow for better access for meter maintenance and or collecting reads. And leak investigations coming in at 9% of the customer service workload. Meter turnoffs are at 1%, which is extremely low due to the critical need for water during these difficult times. And I think across all of our programs, the pandemic has really put our community impact into perspective for all of us. Next slide, please. And so the last performance highlight I'm going to speak on is our fire hydrant maintenance program. It's not currently a P3 performance measure, but it is a required workload that we've integrated into our programs. The ISO, short for the Insurance Service Organization, is an organization that evaluates municipal fire protection capabilities. They mostly interact directly with our fire department and rate the city on multiple fire protection categories to give the city a PPC score or a public protection classification. That score is used as a standard measurement for insurance companies to determine property insurance rates. One of the categories that they rate the city on is water supply and infrastructure. So the condition of our fire hydrants and our annual flow testing results directly affect that score. As you can see, we target our system total of 2,325 city-owned hydrants every 3 years. So a little under 800 hydrants per year. We look at criteria such as functionality, flow capabilities, access and obstructions, proper identification, and even aesthetics such as graffiti removal. And we're looking to add this to our P3 performance measures in the near future. So I hope to have updates for you next time that we speak. And that does it for water distribution. So I'll open it up for questions before passing along. Any thoughts or concerns?
Great. Thank you for the presentation. Are there any questions or comments from commission members at this point? A lot of work. Just compliment on the amount of work you guys do. Again, on all these divisions, boy, it's 24/7, 365. And, it's just amazing because you're out of sight, out of mind for most people, but incredible work that you folks do. So thank you for that.
Appreciate
Okay. Okay, want to continue with the presentation or where are we at right now?
Yeah, thank you for your time, commissioners. I'll be passing along to Principal Engineer Philip Maldonado.
Great.
Next slide, please.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Mr. Days. And good morning, commission members. My name is Philip Maldonado. I am the interim principal engineer with our Water Resources Engineering Group. And I'm here to provide updates on the capital projects being implemented for the water system. I will review these projects by the different project areas within the water system. These areas are water distribution, recycled water, water treatment, reservoirs, and desalination. Next slide, please. For water distribution, we focus on 3 primary projects: the city's annual water main replacement project, the water distribution transmission main renewal project, and the desal link. Now, for reference, the image on the right is a recent photo from the desal link project. It really shows the scale of this type of pipeline installation and how it impacts the other assets the city manages. Next slide, please. We begin with our annual water main replacement project. The map on this slide identifies recent and planned water main replacement. The City Council approved an increase to the annual water main replacement goal from 1% to 2% in 2018. This equates to an increase from 3 miles to 6 miles of replaced water main. We have worked to prioritize replacement based on factors which include, but are not limited to, material type, break history, size, installation date, and location. We have also remained adaptable to changing priorities. A primary example is the reduction of this project in fiscal year 2020 due to the COVID emergency. The current project in construction began this past November, with the second phase of this project scheduled to begin construction this coming summer. The next fiscal year project is actually scheduled to begin winter of 2022-2023. Next slide, please. The diagram on this slide depicts the planned pavement maintenance for the next few years. Now, coordinating with our streets division is a key objective to the water main process improvements that have recently been implemented. The extent of both the water main replacement and pavement maintenance projects highlights the need to stay coordinated for effective project implementation and to minimize disruptions for the public. Next slide, please. I would like to take a moment to share the effort that we undertook to improve and document our water main replacement process. We realized there would be serious process impacts induced by doubling the size of the water main replacement project. We set a goal to implement this change while minimizing cost impacts and improving delivery schedules, while also modernizing planning for accuracy and efficiency. To achieve these goals, we focused on mapping and defining the process, improving coordination between all stakeholders, clarifying roles and responsibilities, improving the transfer of information, and ultimately building a culture defined by one water, one city. The diagram on this slide is the basic outline of the process workflow our team designed. Each of these areas were identified as integral to realizing the goals we have set. We use a cycle to reinforce the need for communicating feedback and refreshing data streams. Mapping this process helped to identify multiple updates. These include using a multi-year contract for design services, adding pre-designed team site walks, improving asset management and geodatabase workflows, defining roles and responsibilities, and outlining pathways for communication and coordination, just to name a few. We have already started to see implementation benefits. These include improved resource allocation with sequenced capital improvement work between the groups, fewer disruptions to neighborhoods, reduced pavement disruptions, and more areas for cost sharing. Next slide, please. The next project I'd like to discuss is the transmission main renewal. As depicted on this slide, the phase 1 of the transmission main renewal will focus on rehabilitating the existing distribution transmission main between the intersection of Mission and Garden Streets and the Cater Water Treatment Plant. The transmission main pipeline was assessed to be in good condition, allowing us to gain the benefit of using existing infrastructure for much of the distance between the desalination plant and Cater. Rather than replacing this length of pipeline, we are ensuring a high-quality transmission system by strengthening the existing segment and connecting it to the new desal link. The work for this project will replace valves and associated operational equipment along the length of the main, in effect, renewing the system. Construction is currently scheduled for later this summer. Next slide, please. Now, the Commission has heard often about the desal link project, so I will be brief. As summarized on this slide, the project is necessary for enhanced resiliency, extended distribution of desalinated water, and improved water quality. It is scheduled to be in construction through fall of this year. Construction began this past November, starting at the intersections of Mission and Garden Streets. Installation work continues to progress south to the desalination plant. Work has experienced some initial challenges due to large boulders and unforeseen conditions. But as with all of our capital projects, we are working diligently to ensure our existing infrastructure is restored and maintained as this new pipeline is installed to guarantee all of our assets support ongoing public benefit for years to come. Work continues to move south, and we anticipate the pace of installation to continue on a reasonable schedule. Next slide, please. This brings us to the recycled water capital projects. The project focus here is the recycled water distribution pump upgrades. This pump station is the heart of the recycled system. It was constructed in the early 1990s and supplies all of the water for the recycled system. The goal of this project is to replace the mechanical and electrical equipment in the pump station. The city received favorable bids to construct this work, and the project is currently in construction and is scheduled to be complete summer of this year. Next slide, please. We will now review the water treatment capital projects. Our focus is on the Cater Finished Water Reservoir Resiliency Project. The goal of this project is to add a chlorine contact time reservoir to the Cater Water Treatment Plant. The design includes a structural analysis of the existing clear well. The design will also include reconfigured inlet and outlet piping to the clear well. Design for this project began in June of 2021, and the project has established a conceptual design, and this concept design is being analyzed for environmental review and water flow and treatment characteristics. The concept will be defined in the preliminary design report that will be delivered to this winter. Design is scheduled to continue through winter of 2023, and the total estimated project cost is anticipated to approach approximately $20 million. Next slide, please. We will now review the reservoir capital projects. And our focus for the reservoirs is the VicTrace Reservoir Replacement Project. The VicTrace is the city's largest distribution reservoir. It is a critical storage buffer for operational needs. It is worth mentioning that the start of this project must be coordinated with the completion of the Cater Finished Water Reservoir project. The full storage capacity of Cater must be available when this storage is removed for construction. The project is currently in the planning phases. Staff is continuing to develop the needed scope elements and identifying the anticipated challenges. The location itself is a challenge for a project of this size. To support this effort, we have conducted a site survey and property record search this past fall. This property information will be used to support environmental review and public outreach. And this work will help prepare staff for design. And the design contract is scheduled for next fiscal year. This project was identified through the water distribution infrastructure planning effort, and the total estimated project cost at this point is just over $40 million. Next slide, please. Finally, we'll discuss desalination-related capital projects. For desal, we focus on the product water pump station upgrades. The product water pump station upgrades are needed to help move water up to the Cater water treatment plant from our desalination plant. Water can be distributed to all portions of our system once water is moved to Cater. The project is nearing 100% design and is scheduled to begin construction in summer of this year. And with that, that concludes my portion of the presentation. So I leave it open to any questions if there are.
Okay, I'm going to look for any questions. I actually have a question relative to process for Mr. Hagmark and Ms. Becerra. We've moved over from GoToMeeting to Zoom, and I've been looking for people to raise their hand. I noticed that Commissioner Kemmerer had a question in the previous section, and she turned her camera on, but I wasn't looking for that. I was looking for the Zoom raise hand or something else. So we'll come back to talk about what our procedure is. Right now, I'm going to be looking for raised hands. If you go down to your taskbar at the bottom, there's a raise hand thing. So is anyone who wishes to raise their hand on this item? And I'll actually come back to you, Cora, basically for your other question. Any questions? Go ahead, Jeff.
Thank you. And so I'm just curious, the cost for the desal capital projects, I don't think I heard a number.
With the desal capital, the product water pump station upgrades project, right now our current estimate is around $3.5 million. And actually, Mr. Ward or Mr. Hagmark, please correct me if I'm misstating that.
So, I mean, that's close enough. I'm just looking for kind of an estimate. So I heard 40 million for one upgrade and 20 million for another. It's a lot of money to me, to my ears. I just want to, hear from you guys how this is expected, it's anticipated, it's all within our budgeting, and there's no red alerts here.
Chair Davis, Vice Chair Young, exactly. The recently adopted rates that we have anticipated, they went out planning out a 10-year cycle. And so we only adopted rates for 3 years, but we were looking out, and those costs that have been mentioned were included in that planning process. Yes.
Thank you.
Now, what's not included is a drought. So that would be a change in that plan. But right now, those costs are embedded in the rates that we have.
Well, how does that impact this when you say drought? So that means what in terms of capital project expenditures?
Well, our current plan and spending assumes a certain level of revenue coming in based on water sales. And so should we choose to move or have to move to mandatory conservation and additional reductions in water sales, that would have impacts that are not yet incorporated. So we'd have to respond to that if that happened.
Got it. Okay. Thank you.
Great. Commissioner Kemmerer, I see you this time.
Thank you, Commissioner Davis. Yeah, I had just, and sorry, the procedure, yes, is new. I had just wanted to circle back to Mr. Days. One, just to comment on presentation, which was just so impressive, so much great work that you all are doing. So thank you. And then I was wondering about the water meter maintenance, and you said it looked like that was a big part of the customer calls. And I was just curious if you are mostly identifying broken meters through customer calls, or if there's other ways that the city is identifying if meters are malfunctioning.
Yeah, the bulk of it comes from customer calls and kind of noticeable leaks that kind of overflow from the meter boxes. But we also have, our meter readers who are doing the routes daily. And so that does initiate some of the need for meter maintenance that they notice, and that kind of gets reported into their information system and makes it to our maintenance groups.
Thank you. And will that change with AMI?
Yeah, there still is going to be a need to do some level of inspection, but yeah, we will probably see less, but we'll probably make up for it in other ways with our attendance to what we have on the field of meter inspections.
Thank you.
Great. Sorry, I missed you last time. Go ahead,
Yeah,
Josh.
I was going to, Commissioner Kammeier, was prior to you coming onto the commission, but roughly in the 2015, 2016 timeframe, we initiated a project to replace all the meters. So all of our water meters have been replaced. And now we're moving forward with AMI, which is attaching basically the communication device to all those meters. So our meters are in the best condition they've been in a long time. And so Robbie and his crews now are ensuring that they're all working properly. A lot of them come with warranties. So making sure if we do have any issues, we get those corrected on the manufacturer's dime. But then, yeah, excited about where AMI can take us in helping us to predict when meters are starting to fail. In particular, when meters fail, they typically start to spin slower, not registering as much water going through the meter as actually it's occurring. So we're hoping with that new software, we can do a better job of predicting what meters are starting to go out. They typically lifespan, Mr. Days, is that 15 to 20? Is that typically
Yes.
a meter lifespan?
Depending on the manufacturer, yeah, 15 to 20 is what we usually see.
Yeah, we also went through a very robust selection process for picking our meters. We did a full RFP. We test meters on a regular basis. And as we were replacing a lot of our meters, we would pull them out and put them on our bench testing equipment. So that way we could see how they were performing and kind of analyze where we're at.
Okay. Other questions at this point for Mr. Maldonado? Philip, I guess I don't see any. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Davis. At this point, I'll turn it back over to Mr. Ward to close out the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Maldonado. So we just wanted to touch briefly on some of our other water system program highlights. We do have some developing programs, and wanted just to get this in front of the commission, and in future years we'll be adding to this presentation, or perhaps an entirely separate presentation on our water service, our customer service group. This is a new work group formed of existing employees in areas that focus a lot on customer service, as well as some new leadership in the customer service work group. And they're currently very focused on AMI, which I'm going to touch base on briefly. And we also wanted to connect on our desal contract operations briefly. Next slide. So we presented this over a year ago, and this just shows that we were looking at moving some programs around in water resources to focus more primarily on customer service. And so the strategic move moved certain programs from water and wastewater under the water supply and services manager. And the main focus being, again, on customer service and the changes going on within our metering infrastructure. Next slide. So a brief update on our water service and customer service program is we did hire a new water service superintendent, Teresa Lancy, who you know, and she is bringing strong leadership to that group. We also hired a new water service supervisor role, which we filled in November. That team is currently under really focused on AMI, but then They're also looking at all things customer service related, both for our customers, but also internally and how Water Resources works as a customer service organization. And some of the AMI implementation focus is currently on customer communication, outreach, noticing, billing, and how the AMI system is going to function in this new environment. And also looking at our internal operational needs and how we're going to be able to use AMI data to create a more analytical organization and use that information for shaping our programs at large. Next slide. So the AMI project, I'm happy to report, is on schedule and it is currently in the alpha phase. The alpha phase includes setting up software and doing mostly like a proof of concept, and that is scheduled to continue until May. And then this summer, we're going to begin our beta phase. Our beta phase is going to include a test population of our meters, about 2,500 radio endpoints on our meters that we're going to begin testing our software with. And then once that is complete, we're going to be looking to deploy late this summer the rest of the remaining radio endpoints. And we'll be operating that system for over a year as we test it and make sure that it's ready for public consumption and that we've got all the software communicating the integration done and complete. Next slide. And last, we just wanted to connect in our desal operations. It's a key supply for the city. It's something that we're integrating into our the rest of our system and into our treatment facility hub at Cater. That contract is going to be expiring in September 2024. We're going to be evaluating future operations. And with that, that brings me to final questions. Next slide.
Well, thank you, Mr. Ward. This has been a very complete and informative presentation. I see a hand raised by Councilmember Sneddon. Then I'll go to Commissioner Young after that. Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair Davis. I just really want to make a comment that I love this presentation because it's so comprehensive with all the inner workings and the customer service. And I'll say I had a water main break on my block last week, and staff, incredible customer service in restoring that and communicating with the neighbors, and the liaison for COMB and for CCRB. And I can say that I'm so proud of how the city is represented on those regional boards as well, and what leaders we are in that, and the work on the desal line and providing that for the whole city and community. And it's just, it's a real pleasure watching this presentation and just having the details of how much work and coordination goes into us turning our taps on and getting that water. And so well done, and just thank you.
Great. Here, here. Commissioner Young?
Yeah, I was just going to say I appreciate the presentation also. And when you really get to see the quantity of the components that are involved,
right,
whether it's the the miles of pipe, or the valves that have to be turned, or the fire hydrants, it really is quite impressive. I appreciate seeing staff really on top of all of these components, because it's really critical, to making sure that Santa Barbara gets water. We take it for granted when we turn on the tap or we flush the toilet, but there's a lot that goes into that to make sure that that happens without any problems. Anyway, thank you.
I second all those comments. Madam Clerk, do we have anyone from the public who wishes to speak on this item?
Chair Davis, we do not have public comment at this time.
Great. Are there any other questions from commissioners? Okay, not seeing any. Mr. Ward, the rest of your staff, thank you so much for the presentation. Again, as I said, very informative, and I will second all the comments of the great work which all of you do that basically none of us really see. We turn on our water and it's all coming out all good. Thank you.
Chair Davis, thank you very much. And thank you to the rest of the Water Commission. We appreciate the opportunity to be here in front of you, and we look forward to feedback. This presentation really is for you, so and the rest of the public. So thank you very much.
No, it's
and
really
with that, I'll
It's really great to see your staff too. Thank you for bringing them in and giving them a chance to basically talk to us about what they do, because I know they're very proud of what they do and they should be. Thank you again. Have a great day, everybody. I'm going to move on then to item 6B. This is the recycled market assessment. Ms. Corey, good morning.
Good morning, Chair Davis, Water Commissioners. My name is Dakota Corey, and I'm the Water Supply Analyst for the city. And I'm excited to bring this project to you today. This is just an informational item. The Recycled Water Market Assessment is a project that's coming directly out of our Enhanced Urban Water Management Plan, which you all know was a big work effort for the supply group and for Water Commission over the last couple of years. So I'm excited to share with you this next step in some of our water supply planning. Next slide, please. This is just a brief outline of my presentation. We'll talk a little bit about the background for the Recycled Water Market Assessment Project, and then I'm going to dive into an overview of the city's recycled water system for some background and context. We'll talk a little bit about the future of potable reuse in the city because that provides additional context to this project. And then finally, we'll talk specifically about the project scope of work and contracting. Next slide, please. So background on the Recycled Water Market Assessment Project. As I mentioned earlier, it is a direct policy recommendation from our 2020 Enhanced Urban Water Management Plan. That recommendation was to update the 2009 Recycled Water Expansion Assessment, which was a project undertaken by city staff and consulting firms in 2009 to look at the opportunity to expand the recycled water system and connect as many customers as possible. In this new project, we're going to do a similar work effort where we perform a cost-benefit analysis to identify opportunities for increased recycled water consumption within our existing system. Recycled water is an environmentally responsible, drought-proof supply that offsets potable water use. So it has an important contribution to our overall water supply portfolio. And the city wishes to maximize the use of its current recycled water system to the extent that it's cost-effective. So that's really the background for why we're moving forward with this project. Next slide, please. Just a brief history on recycled water within the city. We began planning for recycled water in the early 1980s, and phase 1 of the project was completed in 1989. That included tertiary treatment with carbon filtration and disinfection, a distribution reservoir, a pump station, and 5.1 miles of distribution main. Phase 2 was completed in 1992 and added an additional pump station and reservoir and 8.3 miles of additional recycled water distribution main. Next slide, please. In 2009, that water supply planning study I mentioned earlier looked at market assessment and analysis of potential pipeline expansion to add new customers to the system. And then in 2015, we made upgrades to the tertiary treatment plant to include microfiltration and ultrafiltration to make sure that we were meeting water quality treatment requirements for tertiary treated recycled water. Next slide, please. This is a map of our recycled water distribution system. You see the purple pipe, which is identified by the purple line that goes along the coast and then up towards the municipal golf course. And then also the green polygons represent different parks and landscapes that are served by the system. The recycled water system serves primarily large landscape, including parks, schools, HOAs, et cetera. We also serve some toilet flushing and a few other uses, but it's mainly a landscape supply option for the city. And we have about 95 customers currently. Next slide, please. Just a brief overview of who can use recycled water. It is an entirely separate distribution system from the potable system. So in the previous presentation, we got to see some maps of the potable system. This is entirely separate. To have recycled water at a site, it requires an on-site supervisor. So it's really important that there's not any cross connection or contamination between the potable system and the recycled water system. So this supervision is required. As I mentioned earlier, it primarily serves large landscapes, including parks, schools, HOAs, and golf courses, with some limited toilet flushing and dust control uses as well. It is required for the city to have a water sales agreement in place if we're going to sell recycled water to another water agency. And you'll recall that we recently initiated a recycled water agreement with La Cumbre Mutual Water Company to serve the golf course up there. So staff does require direction from council if we're going to start negotiations for selling recycled water to another agency. One thing that this slide doesn't say specifically, but it's kind of inherently implied, is that recycled water isn't usually supplied to single family residential customers. And that's just because the nature of having a site supervisor and making sure that there's no cross-contamination between the two potable and recycled water systems is pretty onerous, and it really doesn't make sense at the single family residential level. Next slide, please. This slide provides an overview of recycled water costs. And again, this is really to provide context for this study that we're going to be undertaking moving forward. So recycled water customers pay for the O&M costs, or operations and maintenance costs, related to the recycled water program, and a portion of the capital costs for annual system renewal and replacement needs. What that means is the potable water customers fund major improvements to the water system as a whole, both recycled and potable, because recycled water provides a reduction in potable water demands, so it provides a benefit to the potable water system. Recycled water is one of our more expensive supplies. It costs about $1,400 per acre foot. In comparison, water from Lake Cachuma is about $1,000 per acre foot. Groundwater ranges from about $500 to $900 per acre foot, depending on the level of treatment. Current recycled water customers pay $4.53 per HCF of water used, as compared to our potable irrigation customers for recreation. They pay $5.22 for tier 1 usage, and then $25.41 for tier 2 usage. And our commercial potable irrigation customers pay $13.77 per HCF for tier 1 usage, and $25.89 for tier 2 usage. So there is a lowered cost to include to encourage recycled water connections, and also because the quality is not quite as good as our potable system, and really it's best used for irrigation purposes and only permitted for those purposes. Recycled water treatment is energy intensive. To give that some context, it's not as energy intensive as desal, which, as you know, needs microfiltration to make the water potable for drinking water standards, but it is more intensive than our surface water sources or our groundwater sources in terms of the level of treatment to take wastewater effluent and treat it to the standards necessary for supplying recycled water to our landscape customers. Next slide, please. So how much recycled water do we have available in the city? A design capacity of the El Estero Water Resources Center is for 11 million gallons per day. The average daily flow into the El Estero Water Resources Center is 6 million gallons per day. And then of that, from the recycled water system, our peak production capacity is 2.5 million gallons per day, or about 3,000 acre feet per year. So I'm switching to acre feet since that's what I think in as a water supply analyst. Now, what I want to do is focus your attention here on this graph on the right, and you can see our demands on the system and that they're seasonal. So our highest demands are in the peak summer months, and that makes sense because it's landscape irrigation. So when it's hotter and drier out, our landscapes need more water. And so what this last bullet is saying is that we have lower irrigation demands in the spring, fall, and winter. And so essentially it makes the capacity of our recycled water system about 1,400 acre feet per year versus the 3,000 in the bullet above. And what I'm really talking about here is if we look at this graph, all of the white spaces in the spring, fall, and winter months are months where we could produce more recycled water in terms of plant capacity, but we just don't have the demand for it because irrigation demands are low in those months. So that kind of seasonally adjusts our total capacity on the system to about 1,400 acre feet per year. Now, if we could find some demands in those winter, spring, and fall months, we could increase that seasonal capacity. Next slide, please. So then let's look more specifically about recycled water production and demand. Our current demand on the system is about 1,000 acre feet per year, which includes about 230 acre feet of water that's used for processing in El Estero. That represents about 9% of the city's total water demand. Since the 2009 market assessment, we have connected additional customers for a total usage of about another 100 acre feet per year. And then, as you know, we also recently signed our recycled water sales agreement with La Cumbre Mutual Water Company, and they are able to take 40 to 100 acre feet per year under that agreement. And so with some basic sort of back of the envelope math here, it shows that we have about 200 acre feet per year of remaining demand for new customers. And so when we're kicking off this recycled water market assessment, we're going to better refine those numbers, but that shows you kind of the possibilities for new connections and new supply within our existing system. That's really what we're targeting when we're looking at this recycled water market assessment. Next slide, please. I do want to take a minute to talk about potable reuse because that is in our future. The city conducted the 2017 potable reuse feasibility study to look at the future potential for potable reuse within the city. And through that study, it was determined that raw water augmentation at Laurel Reservoir was the most feasible option for potable reuse at the city. And so what that means is there would be an advanced treatment facility located down near El Estero, and then that water would be pumped up to Laurel Reservoir, where it would blend with our other supplies that flow into Laurel, like Cachuma and Gibraltar supplies, before it's treated once again at Cater Water Treatment Plant and then distributed to our customers. What that means is that a portion of the recycled water distribution system, which I mentioned earlier is separate from the current potable system, would be repurposed to move that advanced treated water from Laurel or from El Estero up to Laurel Reservoir. And so that would essentially make our current recycled water system obsolete, since those pipes would be used for a new purpose and those customers would be served potable water, although we'd have a new source of potable water, which would be potable reuse. Next slide. So the potential for potable reuse within the city, we dove a little bit deeper on this in our 2020 Enhanced Urban Water Management Plan, and potable reuse was shown to be the second best performing new supply for the city after desal expansion. We looked at two different scenarios for potable reuse in the Enhanced Urban Water Management Plan. One considered 2,900 acre feet per year, and another scenario considered 6,000 acre feet per year of potable reuse production. As you know, there's additional evaluation needed regarding the feasibility of potable reuse for the city, or maybe not the feasibility, but to actually implement potable reuse. We need a lot more information on costs, and then a lot of that is also tied to the regulatory environment. Final regulations for potable reuse and raw water augmentation have not been propagated for California yet. And once we fully understand what the regulatory requirements are, we can come up with better costs and better refine the project and better understand how feasible potable reuse would be for the city. But what that means is the timeline for additional potable reuse regulations is probably 15, 20 years. And so that really provides an umbrella over this project that I'm talking to you about, the recycled water market assessment, because it cuts the timeline for the benefits to those new customers to 15 to 20 years, when typically a capital project might have a longer lifespan. So that's really where the context comes in for this particular project. And we'll explore that further as we work on this project. I'm seeing some cameras come on. Do we need to pause for questions?
Yeah, I was going to wonder, Jeff, you didn't raise your hand, but I see a hand from Jeff. Jeff, down on the taskbar, there's a raise a hand symbol, which you can see for future things. But I'm going to go to Jeff, and then I'll come over to Cora. Go ahead, Jeff.
Thank you. So where is the state in terms of its regulatory process? Do they have a blue panel committee that is studying portable reuse? Do they have any facilities in the state that are actually attempting to reuse potable water this way?
So I'm going to let Mr. Hagmeyer jump in on this too, but to first answer your question, there is regulatory effort to release guidelines, and there were draft guidelines for potable reuse released recently with a review period. I think where it gets a little bit more nuanced is there's different types of potable reuse. So there is potable reuse where you treat, wastewater effluent and you can stick it in the ground and let it have travel and contact time in the groundwater basin and then pump it back out. And some of those projects are already operating within the state of California. A project like that won't work for Santa Barbara because our groundwater basins are just so small. And that's why this raw water augmentation project at Laurel Reservoir made the most sense for the city. And those guidelines specific to raw water augmentation are still being promulgated. I don't know if Mr. Hagmark, you have any additional information to add to that?
No, I think you did a very good job with that. The one thing I would add is that San Diego Water Authority has been working on a basically a very similar project to what we are talking about here, a surface water augmentation, and they are doing it. Basically, the regulators have moved down to San Diego and are working side by side with them on what is in essence a pilot. So that they're intending to kind of prove that that can be done. And I think based on what their preliminary numbers are showing is they intend to kind of do this pilot through approximately 2034. And assuming that it works, they would move to a more full-scale operation using surface water augmentation. But I caveat it with, and the pandemic kind of underscores this, the challenge with this is if we were talking about human waste from 200 years ago, this type of treatment is super easy. We got our hands around it. The challenge remains, how do you stay ahead of all of the, we'll just put it, interesting constituents that end up in our wastewater stream? And to that end, the challenge that the state is having is how do you ensure under every circumstances those will never get through. And because if it happens once anywhere, it basically is the death nail to potable reuse. And so they're moving very cautiously. And I've even reached out to Water Commissioner Keller to come speak to the commission about where the conversation is on DPR, because there is a lot of excitement around it. I think the state has worked up a framework, but as far as what we really need to know in order to be 100% confident, there's a lot of technology gaps. And I can say I'm not an expert in that area, and Mr. Keller has been, Commissioner Keller has been doing actually quite a bit of work in that area and has agreed to come speak to us actually in February on this topic.
Good, okay. Thank you.
Mr. Kammeier, Cora.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Corey. It's really interesting presentation. I had a couple of questions. I'm going to try and pick a few for the sake of time, but one was around the recycled water quality. You mentioned, of course, it's a lower quality than potable drinking water, but are there quality issues in terms of salinity levels or any issues with irrigation?
That's a really good question. And unfortunately, I don't have the data in front of me, but when we started the recycled water system, we did a multi-year salinity study, and we found no negative effects from the salinity and the sites that we were studying in terms of using it. What happens is essentially what we saw was the salts would build up a little bit from the use of recycled water, but then we'd have rain events and that would flush out the systems, and that the landscapes actually perform very well under those conditions. That is data that we have access to. And I did a presentation last fall with some of that information, and I'm happy to dig that up and send it your way if you want to get more specific numbers.
Sure, thank you. And then I was also wondering, when you were explaining the kind of capacity of the recycled water system and the demand and the variability of the demand over different months of the year, and you talked about there is still some room to add to service more demand, but I was a little bit confused of whether that's only in specific months or if even in the peak summer demand, there's still room to serve more.
That's a good question. I'm happy to clarify that. So the demand that we're identifying right now is about 200 acre feet per year, and that is even through peak summer demands. And so the limitation on that is actually those peak summer demands. That number could be larger if we could find, customers that had demands, and especially in the winter, but the spring and fall. And we'll dive deeper into refining those numbers as part of this project.
And then just a last question, just kind of for consideration, is whether, so you mentioned that if go to DPR, that the existing purple pipe system would essentially be no longer necessary. And I was just wondering if there would be any reason to maintain a separate non-potable system. If there's like less treatment costs or something, like in cases where you don't need potable water, like for irrigation, if there would be any benefit, or if the cost of having to maintain a totally separate system would outweigh that.
That's another really good question. I'm not sure that I have the best answer. Let me give it a shot. And then again, Mr. Hagman can jump in if I missed the boat on this one, but having two separate systems is quite a bit of cost to maintain. And so I think there would be benefit to just having one potable system. As part of the scope of work for this specific project, the recycled water market assessment, our selected vendor is going to look at a couple of different potable reuse scenarios and how they influence the future of recycled water within the city. And so that is something that we could look at and dive a little deeper on as part of this scope of work. Mr. Hagmark, do you have anything else to add to that?
Yeah, and I really appreciate the line of questioning, and I'm hoping we can, further refine this conversation as part of the study. But, as we've kind of presented so far, right now potable water customers are in essence helping to make the recycled water system work. The recycled water rates do not cover the cost of actually operating that system, and so. To continue to maintain this separate system. Maybe there's a time where it makes sense to do part of it, but once you have to start replacing that system, I think that's what we'll kind of explore. Maybe there's a window in time where there's still some life in the recycled water plant, and there's still some life left in the distribution system, recycled water distribution system. But I think long-term, I'm interested in getting everyone utilizing the same system, because that right there, we're struggling to just maintain that one system. And I think the incremental cost of taking this, although it'll be significant, is really a drop in the bucket compared to the full cost of operating two systems, and not having to have these contracts with these separate users with very limited use. Because, unfortunately, really this water is being used to irrigate turf, which is really not a community priority. It's, and I think we could accomplish that by having one water system. Yeah, I hope that helps. It's a good question. It's a great, I really appreciate the question, and I'm hoping we can do a good job of answering that concisely in the study.
Any other questions? Any other hands raised at this point? Okay, Ms. Corey, you can continue. Thanks.
Okay, let's move to the next slide. So now let's look a little bit more specifically at the scope of work associated with this project. So that was a nice transition, Commissioner Kmeyer, thank you. There's a few main tasks within this project. The first is to evaluate the city's current non-potable recycled water demand and system. And so that's really redefining these numbers that I went through broadly earlier in the presentation about how much extra demand or production capacity do we have available to serve new customers. From there, the consultant will look at new recycled water demand analysis. And so what that means is looking at our existing potable customers and their demand and their spatial location, and determining which customers might make good new customers. And so this will be both an analysis of current potable customer demand, as well as a spatial analysis using GIS to sort of cluster those customers in a way that would make cost-effective projects in terms of connection to the recycled water system. From there, we start looking at the cost-effective analysis. And so we'll have a cost per acre foot for connecting these new customers that are identified in the second step. And the basis of the cost effectiveness will be if it's less expensive than our current cost for state water project water or desalinated water, which are our two current most expensive supply sources, then we would determine those new customer connections would be cost effective. The consultant will also, again, consider the future of potable reuse as kind of the overarching umbrella of context within this project. So again, as I mentioned in the past, that will shape the lifespan of this project. They're also going to dig a little bit deeper into some of these regulatory questions that were raised today, and maybe even some of the more detailed feasibility questions that have been raised about potable reuse. They've also included an uncertainty analysis. So that's looking at key influences on all the assumptions made, such as increasing customer demand, climate change, et cetera. And they'll perform that uncertainty analysis to understand how the larger context that this project is operating in is affected by a level of uncertainty. Next slide, please. We have already identified some potential sites. These have been identified by customers reaching out to staff or staff's acknowledgement of these sites and their location to the existing recycled water system. And I really wanted to share this slide with you all today because I know you might have some customers that you would like to add to this list. So I'm open to suggestions. I've listed here some of the sites that have already been identified. Most of them probably look familiar to you. The 35 Anacapa Street is just an address, so you might be wondering what that is. That's a new mixed use project that is currently being permitted, and it's located on the current recycled water system, so has the potential to be a recycled water customer. So definitely open to feedback for anything else that we want to, any other sites we would want to specifically take a look at for this study. Next slide. So through a competitive bidding process, staff found that Carollo Engineers was best suited to conduct the recycled water market assessment for the city. They have extensive recycled water experience, so they've done many of these market assessments in the past. And they also have a lot of experience specifically with the city and our systems and our potable reuse work that's been done to date. So they really understand that context and the interaction between potable reuse and recycled water specific to the city. They also provided the lowest cost proposal. The timeline for this project will be a kickoff next month in February 2022, assuming that council approves the contract on January 25th. And then we expect a final report in July of 2022. Next slide, please. And I think this is questions. So I'm ready for Commissioner Kamar's question.
Go ahead, Cora.
Thank you. Could you go back to the slide that had the potential new customers? Yeah, great. I was wondering on these, it looks like a lot of them are parks or public spaces that have turf that people use, but I was also wondering, like, to what extent are there opportunities to place non-functional turf with lower water intensity landscaping as opposed to just using recycled water to irrigate turf that maybe doesn't need to be there, especially if we're thinking of longer term about eventually transitioning away from a non-potable irrigation source?
That's a really good question. Our water conservation team is quite, what's the right verb? Aware of landscape uses within the city, and they have done quite a bit of work to develop landscape standards for the city, which are actually more restrictive than the state baseline standards in terms of how potable water is applied to landscape within the city. So for example, like a commercial site is only allowed to apply potable water to 20% of the landscape area. And our conservation team does check all new site plans to make sure that they conform with our landscape irrigation standards. Mr. Hagmark, do you have something else to add to that?
Yeah, I thought that was a wonderful question because I do know that our parks are very sensitive to costs. And when I say that, I mean not only in the form of the cost of the recycled water, but also the cost to maintain the turf, to mow it, to take care of it. And I know they have already moved to more drought tolerant seed turf that they use. But I think that's an interesting one to kind of, we'll try and explore that as part of the study. But, you know, even if we were to say to, for example, our Parks Department, hey, the water is half price or it is free, I don't know that they would use all that much more water because of the increased intensity of maintenance, which is also a significant cost and staffing issue for them. So it's a really interesting dynamic that I guess I'm glad that the Parks Department is almost already treating recycled water like potable water. They already approach it with, okay, this is an expense that we're going to see on both sides of it. And so, yeah, I'm excited that the City Parks Department is already kind of leading the way and thinking about the use of recycled water, I think, in a very healthy way.
Great. I'll just note that on the slide there, Alice Keck Park, that's her name. It's Alice Keck Park.
Thank you for sharing that. Mr. Hagmark shared that with me yesterday, and we debated like if we'd be more confusing or less confusing by adding park.
I had to throw it in there. Anyway, Councilmember Sneddon, please.
Thank you. You can call it the Park of Alice Keck Park.
Oh, there you go. I like that.
So, and thank you for this. And I realize we're going to get more into detail once the study's done. So just a question, this potential sites, this is in addition to the sites that are already using recycled reclaimed water. So it might be helpful to have that complete list as well. So we know in addition to what that we're considering, and some that I just want to check on. So I know City College, and that's a large turf area. The golf course currently is recycled reclaimed. Is that correct?
Yeah, they don't use it on a portion of the grass because of how it affects the golf game. Mr. Hagmark, can you be more specific than I am? I think they use it on the fairways, but not on the putting greens?
Yes, that's exactly right. The putting greens are incredibly sensitive to salt, and we've gone back and forth with them. And so they have, you know, and it's a much smaller use, but they do use potable water on the greens. And so we also provide to the Montecito Country Club. They also are a big recycled water customer, and they also have potable water just for the greens right around the, I'm not a golfer, but.
Okay, so those are important, I mean, considerations. And then can you confirm for me about Ortega Park, or all of our parks, or just some of our parks?
So
Ortega
I don't.
Park is connected.
Okay, thank you. I don't have the list in front of me. I'm absolutely happy to provide that though. I can definitely do that.
Thank you. I think that'd be helpful when we're considering additional places to know what's already covered on that. And then I guess I just want to make an overarching statement, and I'll speak for myself and not for council, but something to consider because it comes up a lot. It's come up again today. The question of whether turf is a community benefit or not. And I don't think we should make the assumption that it's not. I think sometimes there's the viewpoint that some green spaces throughout the city are worthwhile having for community benefit. And I don't think that we should put all of green turf in the category of let's hardscape it all or make it some other type of planting. I'm not saying I would make the conclusion one way or the other, but I don't think we should go into this study with that conclusion. And that wasn't actually in response to Commissioner Kemmeyer's comment. It's more, it comes up with De La Guerra Plaza. It comes up with the police station. It comes up with the historic Mission Rose Garden area. And I really want this to be an open investigation and not presume that maintenance costs or a particular department will drive that conversation, because it may be a council decision that these are worthwhile and will subsidize it and do what it takes to make them happen. Again, I'm not saying that will be the conclusion, but I don't want to predetermine that that's not the conclusion, if that makes sense. I don't know. I know we're heading that direction, but I do still think there's value in community green spaces, particularly for our underserved and underrepresented populations who may not have yards or gardens. So I'm just keeping that in mind through this study to really look at what those cost points are, but let's not put maintenance in there as our deciding factor at this point. So
thank you so much, council members. That's a wonderful point, because you're right. There are really high value uses of turf in the community, and I think they provide a space, particularly as we have a denser community. You need to have humans have not evolved to be stuck in little holes, so you need to have those open spaces and the greenery and spaces to get out. And I completely agree, and we will do our best to try and capture that discussion in the study here.
Thank you so much. Looking forward to it. Thank you.
Commissioner Kammeier, Cora, please.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to make an aside on that because I absolutely agree, Councilmember Sneddon. And I was recently learning about what Las Vegas is doing around banned non-functional turf. But I recently heard a presentation from them and the process that they're going through to have like a community-driven discussion about what non-functional versus functional turf is, and having a stakeholder group that different representatives from the community. And I know that this is a discussion that's happening at the state level, but I think I really liked that approach of it being kind of a city-wide and community-driven discussion about the values, because I absolutely agree that, you know, in some cases having turf in our parks and other places in the community is super important and valuable. So just wanted to share that.
Good input. Thank you very much. Okay, Ms. Corey, I don't see any other questions. You want to continue?
I believe we're actually at the end of the presentation.
At the end of the presentation.
Yep, there we are. So if there's any more questions, I'm happy to field them.
Let me check with the clerk, see if there's anyone from the public who wishes to speak on this item.
Chair Davis, we do have public comment. Let me navigate to the timer. Okay, we have Allison Thompson that would like to make a public comment. Let me unmute her.
Okay, can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, we can. Thank you for that. Go ahead.
Perfect. Okay, thank you so much, Chair Davis and fellow commissioners and staff. I just wanted to take a brief moment of your time to thank staff, Ms. Corey and Mr. Hagemark for putting together this presentation and for evaluating the need of recycled water and updating this study for our community. Heal the Ocean is very excited to see what results from this study, and we just appreciate that you're looking into this and prioritizing recycled water for our community. So thank you all so much for the time and the presentation. We learned a lot, and it's great to, you know, continue seeing recycled water expand.
Great. Thanks, Ms. Thompson, for your comment. Ms. Becerra, is there anyone else who wishes to speak?
Not at this time. One moment, let me remove permissions to speak from Ms. Thompson, and back to you, Chair Davis.
Great. Thank you very much. Good. Thank you. Ms. Corey, thanks for the presentation. Again, very informative, and we'll look forward to seeing that study come back sometime in the summertime, I guess, the presentation. So projected. We're pretty much right on schedule right now, so we will go to item 6C. This is the wastewater rate study update. Mr. Hagemark, do you want to kick this off and introduce Ms. Hoffenberg?
Yes, I would love to. Chair Davis, Water Commissioners, Joshua Hagemark, Water Resource Manager. and excited today to bring forth the wastewater rates. We've been talking in October. We brought to you the capital program. We talked a lot about the operation and maintenance of the wastewater system. And today we're really getting into what are the revenues needed to support that. And as many of you know, Malcolm Hamilton has left the city, and Dana Hoffenberg, our water supply analyst, analyst for the city, has stepped forward and volunteered to actually lead the wastewater rate study. So I want to bring her on. You've probably recognized Dana. She's presented on quite a few issues over the years, and she spends a lot of time interacting with our customers on rate issues. So she's got a vested interest in this process and leading this effort. So with that, please take it away, Ms. Hoffenberg.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Dana Hoffenberg. I'm a water resources analyst, and I'm going to be going over our wastewater rate study update with you. And I'll be joined later on by Sean Korn with HDR Engineering, who is our expert rate consultant. Could go ahead and do the next slide, please. So first off, I want to start with just some key themes. These are the things that are top of mind when we're looking at developing our rates and our financial planning. So of course, we have ensuring the public safety and environmental protection through investment. Our Water Resource Center at El Estero is perhaps one of the most important pieces of infrastructure in the city when it comes to protecting public health and safety and the environment. So it's really key that we make sure that we're investing in this piece of infrastructure. And so we are really invested in environmental protection that this piece of infrastructure provides. Some of these programs, for example, are our FOG program, our Fats, Oils, and Grease program, our renewable energy program. For example, the plant is going to be moving to 100% renewable energy in March, which is exciting. So on that theme of investment, it's really important for us to be investing in our infrastructure to ensure reliability and resiliency. And so we're making critical investments in our treatment system as well as our collection system. And we also recognize a key piece of the overall system is actually private infrastructure, and that is the wastewater laterals that our customers own and maintain. So we're supporting our customers through our sewer lateral inspection program. We're also assessing always if our organizational structure and staffing levels is meeting the needs of the organization. And of course, we're seeing inflationary increases, which is driving costs for operation and maintenance, as well as capital costs. So these are all the different costs that we're thinking about when we're looking at these financial plans and rates. And then we're also balancing all of that with general affordability to our customers. We want to mitigate as much as we can impacts to our customers. So we're looking always at ways to minimize impacts to our ratepayers. Next slide, please. So giving you just a little bit of a retrospective of how we got here. So this rate study is a continuation of the city's review and development of cost-based rates. It's a continuation of our past financial planning practices. So what we generally do is we look at a 10-year planning horizon and we create a 10-year financial plan. And then using that 10-year financial plan, we focus on between 3 to 5 years for a specific rate making period. At this point in time, we've decided for this round of rate increases or rate changes to go with just a 3-year planning horizon. With everything being a bit unstable right now with the pandemic, we've decided that it's most prudent just to go with a 3-year horizon for this round. So for our last rate study, we also did a 10-year financial plan. And in that plan, we forecasted a 5% revenue increase requirement for these next 3 upcoming fiscal years. So in this new analysis that we're doing right now, that Sean is going to talk about, Mr. Korn is going to talk about a little bit later, we're seeing that we're actually needing about a 6% revenue increase requirement. So we were able to stay really relatively close to that 5% that was forecasted, despite everything we're seeing in terms of inflation, in terms of increased operations and maintenance costs, and really big increases in construction costs. And we were able to maintain that closeness to forecasted revenue requirements because of our prudent financial planning. So getting into the types of planning that we do, as I mentioned, we had the 10-year financial plan, and something that really informs that 10-year financial plan is our capital infrastructure planning. We have a 30-year infrastructure plan for the Water Resource Center, which I believe you've received a presentation on in the past. So identifying all those key projects and cost of those projects is something that definitely goes into our 10-year financial plan and informs of what we need to look at in terms of rates and revenue requirements. And of course, our wastewater rate setting methodology is aligned with industry best practices. Next slide, please. So some just general goals of the wastewater rate study, in addition to the things I've talked about already. So the main goal is, of course, to provide sufficient revenue to operate the wastewater system and maintain the city's wastewater infrastructure. In doing this rate study, we're also making sure we meet the intent of Proposition 218, which requires that we develop rates that are proportional and cost-based rates. We also want to make sure that we are maintaining our prudent financial planning criteria, which includes maintaining our target debt service coverage ratio, and that's essentially making sure we're maintaining our credit rating. And then we also have to make sure we have enough funds on hand to fund all of our capital projects. And we also have to have funds to fund our minimum reserve balances, which are set by City Council. And overall, the rate study is developed using generally accepted methodologies tailored to the city's system and customer characteristics. Next slide, please. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Sean Korn with HDR Engineering, who's going to get a bit more in depth on the wastewater rates.
Thank you, Ms. Hoffenberg. Good morning, Chair Davis, Commissioners, and Councilmember Smedden. Sean Korn with HDR Engineering, the project manager for the rate study for the city. As Ms. Hoffenberg talked about, is we have a lot of goals and objectives that go into this process. And following industry accepted practices, but tailored to your specific wastewater customers, operations, and development of your wastewater system, we go through a 3-step process. This is the process we talked about when we did the Rates 101 a couple months ago, and it's also the same process that we did in the last water rate study and the prior wastewater rate study. And it's really key to go back and meet those goals that were laid out through each of these steps. So that revenue requirement step, which is the step we're going to focus on today, is really a comparison of the existing level of revenues to the proposed costs of the system, both on an operation and capital perspective. And that gives us the first component of the rate study that we want to review, which is what is the overall change in rate revenue that is needed to support the utility. Now that encompasses those goals that Ms. Hoffenberg was talking about, such as protecting the environment, making sure we're meeting all of our operational needs, and we're providing that affordable service to all of the customers. A key element that we'll talk about here in a few slides is looking at how we minimize those overall rate revenue impacts to the system based on that capital funding approach. So we have these capital improvement needs to continue to provide service and minimize the impacts to rates. Once we know that overall revenue need, then we go to the next step, which is our cost of service analysis. We are about done with this. You'll see at the end of the slide presentation here that we'll be coming back to you with those results and recommendations, as well as with the proposed rates as part of that. But this cost of service really gets at the heart of the requirements of Proposition 218. And taking that revenue requirement, proportionally distributing that to each different customer class of service, or the rate schedules that you have in place for your residential and your commercial customers. And so that process takes into account how they use the system. So once we have those first 2 steps done, we know the overall revenue we need, and we know how we're going to collect that, then we can design rates based on that cost of service results to collect that overall revenue that's needed from each class and for the system as a whole. So as I mentioned today, we're going to focus on the revenue requirement. I'll give you a brief update on the cost of service and rate design, but wanted to present this to the commission this morning to gain any feedback or comments as we go through this. So the next slide is our overview of our revenue requirement, the focus of this morning. And really, again, remember, these are not the rates that the customers are going to see. This is really determining the revenue needs in whole for the wastewater utility to support the operating and capital needs. And as we think about the prior slide, then we go into those next phases to ultimately develop the proposed rates. On the next slide, we have some key policy discussion areas, and I broke these up into 3 components here: adequately funding annual operating costs, provide sufficient capital funding, and cost-based rates. So starting to transition that towards our cost of service requirements. As we've gone through this, we want to make sure that we're adequately funding those operating needs on an ongoing basis. I'm sure you're all listening to the news, how we've been talking about the inflation increasing, you know, looking back year over year in the 5, 6, even 7% range or higher in some different areas of the economy. The city's not immune to those inflationary impacts, but as Ms. Hoffenberg mentioned, through that long-term planning and the process that you have in place, we've been able to minimize some of these impacts going forward. Now, as we think about the capital side, she mentioned a few as well. When we get to the capital plan, you'll notice a couple of major capital improvements, and that's some improvements at the El Estero Water Resource Center, as well as some collection system improvements. And then also looking at how we're going to fund those projects. So long-term borrowing is part of the picture that we have in place today, and we need to maintain a healthy financial future in order to continue to minimize rate impacts through some low-interest loan borrowing as we go out and through time to maintain the system. As we do that, we need to think about maintaining adequate debt service coverage ratios, so the credit check for the utility, as well as the overall reserve levels. We have the council policy reserves, making sure we're meeting those as we go forward. And as was mentioned, we're developing the analysis for a 10-year period, but we're really focused on the next 3 years, so fiscal year 23, fiscal year 24, and 25 for our rate adjustments. On the next slide, we'll talk about some of our key assumptions. So when we start the rate study, we base the revenue on the current or recent customer characteristics and those rates that are in place today. So we looked back over the past year. We actually looked back over more data to come back and look at what those differences were. They were fairly minimal. Even with the pandemic, we did see some changing characteristics. But our revenue projection based on the current rates and the customer characteristics is right on with what we've been seeing and what we planned in the last rate study. So that's a good news component of the study. As we think of what this is going to look like going forward, and I'll talk a little bit more about this on the next slide, we have built in some reduction in overall billed wastewater volumes, something we did in the last study as well. And we've assumed very minimal customer growth going forward. So the number of customers is not increasing much at all. And the actual billed volumes, that water that is used to calculate the sewer bill, we're planning on that decreasing over time. At this point in time, we've used a minus 0.2% per year over the 10-year period. So basically a 2% overall change over time. Now, what's important to remember on the wastewater side is that the wastewater billing units are based on the metered water consumption. So as we think about what may be coming forward here, are we out of the drought? How long is the drought going to last? Any requirements for further water conservation measures are now starting to impact wastewater revenues. And I'm going to come back to that on the next slide to give you an example of that. Excuse me. When we look at the operating and maintenance, or O&M, that is based on the fiscal year 2022 budget. We then worked with staff to develop a projected fiscal year 23 budget based on known changes. So that's community choice energy, it's sea level rise planning, that's both on the operating and the capital side. Changes in costs that we're seeing, that inflationary impact we've been seeing for the last year or more, some increases on the overall cost for chemicals and other supplies. And then as part of this process, there are continued increases in regulatory sampling. And so those have been built into this analysis to support those costs going forward based on what we've seen as part of that. Now, we are projecting annual inflation at 3.5% per year. That's globally. We have some costs that are going up more than that, some that are going less than that. But on average, we're looking at 3.5% each year. So again, when we think about that, today we're seeing a higher inflation. Historically, it's not been at that level, but that's what we're planning on as part of this process. We are using the current capital plan, and we are looking, as I mentioned, about issuing long-term debt, some low-interest loans for a couple key projects. And then we're using rate funding and reserves for the remaining component. So on the next slide, I wanted to come back and touch on the overall funding approach and how conservation can impact wastewater rates. So for single family and multifamily, so single family homes and multifamily up to 4 units, they're based on the water consumption, the metered water use, up to 10 HCF, so up to 1,000 cubic feet. The HCF is the billing unit as part of that. And each HCF is 748 gallons. For multifamily and non-residential, then what we see is based on the actual water use with no cap as part of that. But commercial or the non-residential are subject to a minimum charge as part of that. So when we think about this, go back 3 to 5 years, as customers were reducing consumption during the drought, they were above the cap enough to where they would not go below that 10 HCF where it would impact revenues. And so if you hit the button one more time, I believe I have a little chart that pops up here. And so I think we click through this. And so here's some examples of what this residential consumption would look like. So we have someone using 15, someone using 12, someone using 8, 4, and about 3, it looks like. And so as we do this, what we'll see, and you can click through this one more time, thank you. What you'll see is what we bill. So that customer on the far left that was using 15, they only get billed 10. Same with somebody using 12. Now going forward, what we're seeing is that our customers are getting closer on average to that cap. So 3 to 5 years ago, that was around 14 HCF. Now we're coming back to where that average is much closer to that 10 HCF. So what we may see with future, or we will see with future conservation, is that those customers aren't going to be billed at the cap. They're going to be billed at less than the cap. And so the revenues for wastewater will be impacted going forward. So something to consider as we're seeing that usage come down, it becomes a more critical aspect of how we build this into the modeling and how we think of this over a long-term trend and what impact that may have on revenues. And we can definitely come back to this conversation if we need to as we go through this. Right now, as I mentioned, we built in 0.2% decrease as we're going forward, but that we have looked at what it may be if we have to reduce it more than that. So on the next slide, we have, and I'm fine stopping for questions, Chair Davis, if we want to stop at that point. I see a hand raised here on my end. It's up to you all.
No, yeah, it'd be good if you can handle this. Commissioner Kammeier, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, I was curious about the impacts of conservation on wastewater rates. And I was curious if you've looked at what the statewide urban conservation legislation is pointing to and whether that's below or above this cap.
I have, and that's a really good question on the second part of that. I have not compared that. That's actually a good thought. That's something we can all dig into a little, and I can work with staff on that for you all. As part of that, my gut is telling me that yes, it would start driving that lower with what I have read and seen on those plans going forward. To your first question, yes, we did run a scenario on reducing residential single family consumption by another 10%. So that would get us closer to the possible 15% decrease overall. And that would increase the needed revenue adjustments from our 6% annually to the first 2 years being an 8.5%. So about a 2.5% per year increase when you drop consumption by 10%. And that was a somewhat global calculation. We know that some are still above the cap, but many folks are now starting to trend below the cap as we go forward.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Cooney, Lindsay?
Yeah, I actually had a question about the multifamily units billing. So I know that in the last 5 or 10 years, it's become a lot easier to get ADUs in this town or in every town. And is that now, like if you have a permitted ADU, is that now a multifamily unit? And as a result, does that impact your cap? And as a result, sorry to make this a complicated question, but how does that like the increase in those in the city over time, is that baked into your modeling and calculations?
So we did look at that, and I'm going to let Dana answer the account question for you. But we did look at the different, when we went through and set up the revenue projections, we did look at the number of true single family, the multifamily 1 to 4, and then 5 and greater. And we did make some adjustments to that, knowing what's going on with that. And the only growth we're really talking about, the growth I talked about earlier in the assumption, that was the only area that we actually included growth was on that multifamily ADU whole discussion as part of that. Just for the reasons you talked about, that's what we're seeing happening, not only in Santa Barbara, but in other areas. And Dana, do you want to comment on where those ADUs fall?
Sure. Yeah, Commissioner Cooney, that's a great question. The general answer is yes. So if they have an ADU, they have an option to either have a separate city water meter for the ADU, if they would like to do that. Most people do not opt to do that. In which case they just have to have a private sub-meter put on their ADU to help with water conservation so they can monitor the water usage to their ADU. But the city water meter would then serve the main residence and then the ADU. So that's the most common thing that happens. And yes, so once they have their building permit and their project is finished, we should be notified that that's happened, and then we can go in and change their classification from single family to multifamily with 2 dwelling units. And so then that would transition them from being in that first bullet, that class in the first bullet, to the class in the second bullet. And that does change your cap because your cap is based on how many dwelling units that you have on the account.
Fantastic. Yeah, it's just obviously in my neighborhood, there's a lot of permits that have been recently, as you walk your dogs around. And so I was just curious about how that impacted everything. Thank you.
No problem.
I had that same question. Commissioner Kim, are your hands still up? You have another question?
Sorry, I just forgot to take it down.
Okay, great. Could you refresh me while we're still in this particular slide, the cap at 10 HCF per month for single family? Meaning that, in fact, if you use a lot of water, you basically get subsidized somehow by everybody else. Sean, you might be muted.
Thank you, Chair Davis. Yes, so the thought process behind the cap is that not all the water that is used during the course of a year by a single family home is coming back to the wastewater system, right? It's not being flushed down the toilets, the sinks, the drains, et cetera. And so that's that kind of based on what we expect to be that what we call indoor use that would be coming back through the wastewater system. And so during the last study, if you remember, I barely do, so it's okay if you don't. We went through a pretty detailed analysis of what that looked like. We did it for both single family and both multifamily classes. And so that cap still represents that average indoor use when we look at winter water. And then it's, presumably all outdoor water use that would be over that cap, especially in the summer when folks are watering the lawns and doing other outdoor activities.
No, thank you. Actually, I do, now you shake the cobwebs, I do remember the presentation. So thank you for the reminder and the simple explanation. Other questions at this point, or we can go on? Not seeing any other questions. We can continue.
All right, thank you. So this next slide puts together the overall capital funding analysis. So as we talked about at the beginning, for the revenue requirement, there's two key parts. There's our operation and maintenance expense, and which takes into all of our materials and supplies and all the staffing and everything that's needed to maintain and operate the system. Very similar to what you heard from the folks this morning on the water side. We have those same folks on the wastewater side to do all the wastewater activities. The other big piece is our capital funding analysis. And so as we go through this process, we take that current capital plan and we look at how that's being funded over this time frame. Now, remember, our focus is only on the next 3 years, fiscal year 23, 24, and 25, but we wanted to bring a couple key points to you all as we go through this, as we think through the process. So looking at this chart, the dark gray area behind it, as well as the top of each of those bars, is the total capital needs over the 10-year period. So fiscal year 22 to 32, actually our 11 years as part of that are projected as fiscal year 23 and out. The first bar is our rate funded capital. That's that dark black or black bar that's towards the bottom there. What that is the annual reinvestment in the system through rates. And as we go through the financial planning process and the revenue requirement, we need to have a certain amount of funds available to maintain and operate the capital needs of the system from renewal and replacement. During the last study, we started establishing this increase in those funding sources through rates, and you can see that bar increases as we go out over this 10, 11-year period. Now, that's really based on the need to fund those future renewal and replacement so that we're not borrowing or we don't have the funds to maintain the existing system. So that's getting us up to, over the 10-year plan, up to about $10 million, just over $10 million. But that reflects starting to more closely reflect our true replacement costs. And that's really the challenge, is that the infrastructure that's been put in over the last 20, 40, 60, 80 years or more costs more today to put it back in the ground for a variety of reasons, not just simply the cost of the infrastructure. There's also more density, traffic, et cetera, that you need to deal with and costs associated with that. Now, the other part of the funding for each of these bars is the blue piece, and that's using existing reserves. So we're taking money out of our reserves to pay for capital. You can see that's fairly minimal in most years. And the reason for that is we're trending just slightly above our council reserve policies. So we're really not using much of the available reserves, because if we did, we would drop below our council policy and we would have to adjust rates to replenish those and meet those policies. The green bar is our outside long-term debt. And as I mentioned earlier, at this point, for these projects that we're looking at, it is all low interest loans. So as an example, the state revolving fund program that would fund these. And a couple of the key projects here in our early years where you see those bars are up higher than average is the improvements at El Estero for the electrical upgrade. That's over really the 3-year period of 2023 through 2025, those 2 fiscal years. We've got a little bit in 22 for the preliminary start of that project, and the Bramer lift station, which is about $7 million. So that's really the peak you see in fiscal years 23, 24, and 25. And those 2 projects specifically are being funded and plan to be funded through the low interest loan programs as part of this. So as we go through this, what carries into the rates is the bottom bar, that rate funded capital, how much is being funded each year through the rates, and then the annual debt service associated with the green bar. So on the next slide, what I have is a summary of our revenue requirement. And that summary of the revenue requirement starts with our O&M expenses, which is the dark black bar there at the bottom. So that's the annual expenses. You see that slight increase, that's that 3.5% annual inflationary assumption. The blue bar is then our rate funded capital. And what that is the bottom bar from the prior chart. So that's how much we're funding each year through rates to fund capital. We have some little reserve funding in there. You'll see some little slivers of orange between the green and the blue. It's the second line from the top. That's putting money into reserves to maintain those policies or to fund those future projects. And then the green reflects the annual debt service from the borrowing on the prior slide. So when we're paying for capital through those low interest loans, we have additional debt. So you can see starting in fiscal year 24, that green block starts getting a little bit bigger and then continues to increase out through fiscal year 27. The difference between the top of the bars and the dashed line, which is our current revenues, is what we need to fund through rates. So to tip that bar up, so it goes up to touch all the top of the bars over the next 3 years for fiscal year 23, 24, and 25, that's that approximate 6% per year increase. And so that really is what we're looking at as part of this, is getting rates up to an appropriate level to fund both our operating and capital needs over this 3-year period, and then long term when we go out that far over the 10-year period. On the next slide, I have a little bit more of a summary of what those drivers are. Well, we are looking at those rate adjustments to fund our annual inflationary impacts and staffing adjustments as we go out over this next 3 and 10-year period, focus on the 3 years for rate setting. Making sure we have sufficient capital funding for our renewal and replacement. So that's that rate funded capital line that we looked at, as well as other necessary improvements, which the big ones are the electrical project at El Estero, as well as the Braemar lift station, which in the short term are the debt finance, the low interest loan finance. Maintaining our reserve policies. You saw a little sliver in each of those bars on the prior slide that showed what we're putting into reserves. And then, as I mentioned at the beginning, as we're looking at issuing debt, we have to maintain adequate financial metrics. So that's our debt service coverage ratios, our reserves, ensuring that the utility can pay that back over time. Now, to tip that bar up, that's roughly, and again, this is not the rate design, this is that average increase that customers may see, is somewhere between $3.50 to $4.50 per month each year over the 3-year rate setting period. As we complete the cost of service analysis, if there are differences in how we need to collect that revenue from customers based on how they use the system, then that number can change slightly and between the different rate schedules, your single family, multifamily, and non-residential as part of that. So that's the key driver on the overall funding approach. As Ms. Offenberg mentioned at the beginning, given the planning that you all have been doing over time, we have been able to minimize this compared to what we're seeing in other utilities and for what we're seeing with the recent inflationary impacts as part of this. So the next slide has our cost of service and rate design summary. You'll see on the next slide, this will be the next piece in front of the commission for review and discussion. We're about complete with the cost of service and rate design. It's all there. We're doing some fine tuning on part of this, but the key element of that cost of service is looking at how each customer class impacts the system from a volume or the overall wastewater flows that come to the plant and through the system, the strength of that volume or how hard that is to treat, and then a customer or a fixed component that is based on how they utilize the system. And so we proportionally distribute those costs in the cost of service, and it's based on each customer class's annual volume, strength, and number of customers or equivalent unit capacity calculation. That drives our overall results of the study and really puts into place the unit cost, right? Or that monthly fixed charge versus that volumetric charge based on the metered water use as we go forward. And that'll be adjusted based on the results of what we see in the cost of service. So we're going to target the revenue and the revenue requirement that we need, the top of each of those bars. Then we split up those bars by customer class of service, and then we collect that revenue based on those cost of service results. So what we'll be back with you on February 17th is the final numbers for the revenue requirement. I don't see any changes at this point, but any comments, again, are welcome here as part of this. And then the recommendations from the cost of service and proposed rates, what that's looking like going forward. And Chair Davis.
Great, thank you, Sean. before I go to Commissioner Kammer, I just want to thank you again for bringing this back to us, you and staff, bringing this back to us as a progression, basically, to build the study in our own minds. I think it's been quite helpful. Commissioner Kammer, go ahead, Cora.
Thank you. And yeah, just agreed. It's been really helpful to get a couple different touch points on this, and I look forward to the final presentation next month. I'm still getting a little bit stuck on the impacts of conservation and the assumptions around water use that are going into that. I realize we're already over time, and so I don't know if we want to get back into that discussion now, or perhaps we could set up another time to talk, but I would like to dig into that a little bit more.
I'm okay continuing for a few more minutes. Again, no one has indicated we're going to run over probably 15, 20 minutes today. Commissioner Cooney?
Yeah, I actually cannot stay any longer. I apologize. I just have a hard stop right now.
Okay, that's great. We still have a quorum. We can continue. We'll see you next month. Thanks for your work today.
Thank you so much. Have a great month, guys.
You're welcome. Commissioner Kemmeyer, back to your question.
Yeah, so I was just wanting to clarify on that 10 HCF cap, and you said something at the end around how this is only for, I guess, like non-consumptive uses, basically indoor uses that are going back into the wastewater system. Is that correct?
That is the target of how we come back to that 10 HCF cap, is thinking about what is that typical indoor use for that average single family home that they would use inside. That's essentially the basis for that winter use to set that cap. So we're not charging customers, for that outdoor use that they're using on the lawns or whatever they're doing outdoors.
I see. Yeah, I guess for me, it just seems like 10 HCF for only indoor residential use is pretty high on a monthly basis. I'm thinking about my own water bill, which is like 3 HCF. And I was just wondering, and then when you said like the impact that the potential incorporation of conservation would have on the rates, it was pretty significant, a couple percentage points. And so given all of the efforts that the city has put into encouraging conservation, it seems like we should be operating under the assumption that that conservation is going to happen or is very likely to happen, and that should be strongly considered in this rate setting. It just, the 10 HCF seems high to me.
Yeah, and that's a great comment, and I think that's why we brought that slide into this. When we were going through the presentation, we felt like that's an important concept and driver, as we talked about, and what that impact can be. And so that's something we can adjust. One thing to think about as we go through the rate setting process is that under Proposition 218, we're setting the maximum rate. So if council adopts this, as we're going to recommend, after we go through the whole process, that is the rate that has to be in place, or the maximum rate in each of these 3 years. Now, the council can always be below that, right? If conservation doesn't occur at the levels we think it is and impacts to wastewater revenues. But if you had to go higher, then we would have to go back through a Proposition 218 process. So there's this balance that we need to try and make as we go through this of what we expect to occur, what we're planning, and we'll figure out what reality is, right, as we go forward through the process. But that's a great comment, and I think that's something we can kick around my team and the city team on how we want to take that into consideration going forward.
That would be great, thank you. And yeah, I definitely don't pretend to understand all of the factors that go into this, and I'm sure that you're considering them all, but that just kind of raised the flag for me, so I appreciate you looking into it.
Great, thank you. Other questions at this point from the commission? I don't see any hands. Madam Clerk, is there anyone who wishes to speak under public comment?
Chair Davis, we do not have public comment at this time.
Great, thank you very much. This was just for presentation. We will be back next month. I want to thank Ms. Hoffenberg and Mr. Korn for the presentations today. And as said again, thank you for bringing it back in pieces that are at least bite-sized, that we can basically get our hands around, or try to get our heads around at this point. So it's going to help in the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Okay, we will move on then to our last item on the agenda. That is item 7, the Water Resources Manager's Report. Mr. Hagbark.
Hi, Chair Davis. I'm just going to make this brief. First of all, we just finished our 6 months of our fiscal year, and I'm happy to report that both water and wastewater rates are coming in like right on target. So really pleased there. And then slide 11, Ms. Becerra, I just want to point out we ended the calendar year with 10 spills. We're now monitoring our spills, and you can see we had 26 private lateral spills. So not the direction I like to see our public spills going. I think it reflects the challenging year we really had in the collections group with the pandemic and honestly trying to find sufficient staff to keep up with maintenance. So more to come on that. And then the last slide 17, please. And then I wanted to point out we've got, as of yesterday, the latest. This is our COVID RNA testing of the wastewater. We've been doing this weekly since the pandemic began. And we definitely are seeing a significant rise. I've been in several conversations last week and this week with folks from Cottage Health who have admitted that basically they are unable to keep up with the demand for testing. And they are eager to try and get more data from our wastewater because they're eager to find out when we peak.
No, my meeting is done in 2 seconds.
So they're eager to find out when the pandemic will peak in the community because of their own staffing issues. So we are discussing that with them. They are looking for additional grant funding to help sponsor more monitoring than once a week. So this data seems to be helpful in the community now. So we're trying to figure out how to help everybody get the information they need. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay, that's one hand and another hand. I'll start with Commissioner, or actually Council Member Snedden. I'll go to Commissioner Young after that.
Thank you, Chair Davis. Just really quickly, this is incredible. I mean, we've been watching this and it seemed to track and be a little bit ahead of it. And now this seems like confirmation that it really is right in line. And so I actually think this is a big piece of news right here. And I'm really happy we continued with this. And thank you. And I hope it can be of some use for the public health. Thanks.
Yeah, it's been the Water Commission was strongly in support of this. I'm definitely glad we kept doing it. I'm glad we found a good lab that was somewhat affordable to continue this effort. But yeah, I'm excited about where the science on this can go and what it can tell us about other issues going on in our community as far as public health.
Commissioner Young, go ahead, Jeff.
Thank you. I'm curious about the recent rainfall we've had and the app that Mr. Hagmark circulated is really, really informative. I don't know if the rest of you have seen it, but it shows us what's going on at Gibraltar in terms of rainfall, capacity, et cetera. And I'm just curious, we're now like 51% capacity at Gibraltar. Was that to be expected just through kind of a normal year? Does that change how we might be considering using any of that water for our water supply?
Commissioner Young, yeah, so that the website you're referring to is the county's One Water or RAIN website that they maintain. So that's open to anybody in the community. But yeah, that information has a bunch of detailed information on all of our the county water facilities. And yeah, I'm really pleased right now with where we stand. The watershed is ripe for runoff. In fact, we're seeing kind of a constant flow coming in, although it's been dissipating. But definitely been an active flow in the San Ynez River coming in. If only we could get a couple more inches of rain at this point, I think the watershed would really start to flow pretty heavily and you'll see the reservoir come up quickly. So yeah, it's, I'm not saying, I don't want to discount, we probably got 2,000 acre feet of water in Gibraltar now that we didn't have or weren't planning on. So that is definitely improving our situation. But we are, Kachuma really hasn't seen much of a bump at all yet. And so, patiently waiting. January has been a big disappointment, but hopefully we got February and March to we don't need much. Like I said, at this point, we don't need much to really turn this year around, at least for filling Gibraltar.
Are we allowed to draw Gibraltar water at our leisure?
Yes.
Or, okay.
Yeah.
So what's the thinking there behind allowing water to build up versus wanting to utilize it?
Typically, we start to take it as soon as the water quality is good. Typically, when we get these rain events, you get a lot of suspended silt, and these rain events have been gentle. I haven't had a chance to talk with Mr. Rhodes about that, but he may be planning to already bring some water down. But typically, following a rain event, we'll usually shift to other supplies until the water quality improves, and then we'll begin bringing it down.
Great, thank you.
Great. Any other questions for Mr. Hagmark at this point? Mr. Hagmark, could you send that slide out to us for our records after the meeting?
Yes.
Okay, I'm not seeing any other. We're basically at the end of our agenda. Just quick comment back in the water system presentation, there was a slide that showed water main breaks. And I did a quick rough correlation study to when I was involved with the water study, when I worked here and when I got on the commission. And there's a 99% correlation between essentially keeping it low and it's coming down when I was involved. So make sure you note that in the record.
Nice.
Okay.
And Chair Davis, do we want to do a public comment on this? I don't know if there's.
Yes, we do. I hadn't quite got there, but that
Okay.
was my next and final thing was public comment on the manager's report.
Chair Davis, there's no public comment at this time.
Great. Okay. For your record, please show that Commissioner Cooney left the meeting at 11:06. That'll show in the minutes. We are essentially at the point of adjournment. If there's no other items, Mr. Hagmark, anybody else? No other items, I will adjourn the meeting. Next meeting is February 17th at 9 a.m. And given that chart we have up there with the COVID slide, everybody stay safe, right? Be careful, okay?
Bye-bye.
We'll see you all soon. Bye-bye. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, staff. Bye-bye.